They thought she was an easy target, a frail old widow, all alone in her dusty bookshop. The thugs threatened to burn her store to the ground with her inside it. They laughed as they shoved her, leaving her to wait in terror. What they didn't know was that her son, a Navy SEAL, and his K-9 partner were on their way home. The morning in Havenwood, Ohio, wasn't crisp and refreshing, but felt like a warm, damp blanket laid over the small lakeside town. The humidity, the region's oldest resident, clung to the air, making the old brick streets of the historic district slick and causing the leaves of the great maple trees to hang heavy and still. It was in this oppressive quiet beneath the old trees that Eleanor Vance, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair always pinned in a neat bun and eyes that shone with a kind intelligence, opened the door to her sanctuary, Vance's Tomes and Tales. The small brass bell above the door chimed softly, a sound she had always associated with peace, knowledge, and the quiet comfort of her life's work. A widow for nearly a decade, the shop was more than a business. It was a conversation with the past and a legacy from her late husband, Robert. The air inside was cool, smelling of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of the cedar oil she used on the mahogany shelves. Eleanor moved with a gentle, practiced grace, dusting the spines of books that detailed colonial skirmishes and forgotten Civil War heroes. This shop was known in Havenwood, not for its bestsellers. Vance's Tomes and Tales was a haven for scholars, history buffs, and tourists looking for something authentic. Her first customer of the day was Mrs. Peterson, a cheerful neighbor with a passion for gardening. "Eleanor, my dear," Mrs. Peterson chirped. "That book on Victorian garden layouts you found for me was a treasure. My hydrangeas have never looked better. How are you managing this heat?" Eleanor smiled, the expression crinkling the soft lines around her eyes. "I'm holding up, Martha. The books prefer the cool, and so do I. Can I help you find something new?" Their conversation drifted from local gossip to the weather, a comfortable, familiar rhythm that defined Eleanor's days. After Mrs. Peterson left with a thin volume on coastal flora, the shop fell back into its reverent silence. Eleanor glanced at the small, framed photo on her desk. It was her son, Jacob "Jake" Vance, the polar opposite of her quiet world. Jake was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and currently active duty in the Navy SEALs, deployed somewhere she wasn't allowed to know. He was her private worry and her deepest pride. He was coming home. A rare, short leave had been approved, and his text from the night before, a simple, "Wheels up. See you soon, Mom," had made her heart leap. He wasn't coming alone, he was bringing Kaiser, his partner, a magnificent and expertly trained German Shepherd who was retiring with Jake on this last rotation. Eleanor found herself almost as excited to meet the dog. She pictured the noble animal lying patiently by the hearth, bringing a new, protective energy to her quiet home. The thought of them both safe under her roof was the only thing that could cut through the day's oppressive humidity. The afternoon's quiet was broken by the chime of the door. But this time the sound was jarring. The man who entered didn't belong. He was slim, a wiry man in his 30s with greasy dark hair and the restless energy of a predator. His quick, dead eyes scanned the shop, not with interest, but with calculation, as if measuring the value of the shelves themselves, not the books on them. He wore a stained denim jacket despite the heat, and he tapped his fingers impatiently on the counter. "This your place, old lady?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Eleanor, ever polite, nodded. "It is. Can I help you with something?" Slim smirked, revealing stained teeth. "Nah, I ain't much of a reader." He wandered for another minute, his presence like a stain on the clean air. He ran a dirty finger along the spine of a leather-bound book, making Eleanor wince internally. Then, as quickly as he'd come, he was gone. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The faint, sour smell of his cigarette smoke lingered. The bell had chimed as it always did, but it had felt like a warning. She tried to shake off the unease, focusing on her closing preparations. She was moving the day's meager earnings from the register when the bell rang one last time. Her head snapped up, a knot tightening in her stomach. It was Slim again, and he wasn't alone. He was with two other men who seemed born to fill a doorway, blocking the last of the evening light. One was a mountain of muscle with a flattened nose, who Eleanor would later learn was called Brick. The other was as small and twitchy as his leader, earning him the name Weasel. Slim smiled, a cold, empty thing. "Closing time, old lady." "Good. Let's talk business." Eleanor's hands instinctively went flat on the counter. "I think you should leave. We're closed." "We're the new management," Slim said, stepping forward, while his men fanned out, their eyes sweeping the shop with disdain. "See, this neighborhood is getting expensive, dangerous. You need protection, and we're the ones who sell it. Eleanor's blood ran cold, but she thought of Robert, of Jake. This shop was their history. I've never needed protection before, she said, her voice small but firm. I have an alarm system, and the police are very reliable. Slim let out a short, ugly laugh. Alarms, cops? They show up after the fire, lady. We stop the fire from happening. He leaned closer, and Eleanor fought the urge to recoil. $500, every Friday, to make sure all these dusty old books stay safe. Eleanor straightened her spine. She was a widow, not a coward. That sounds like extortion. I will not pay. Please leave my shop now, or I will call the police. Slim's smile vanished. His paper-thin patience had been torn. Stubborn, he hissed. He looked around, his eyes landing on a tall, ornate cherrywood shelf near the front. It held the shop's most precious assets, the first editions, the signed copies, and the volumes her husband had loved most. You love this old junk, huh? Slim said. He nodded at Brick. Show her how fast old junk can burn. Before Eleanor could scream, the massive man slammed his shoulder into the shelf. With a sickening crack of splintering wood and a blasphemous tearing of history, the entire unit crashed forward. Priceless books, decades of curated knowledge, tumbled to the floor in a ruined heap. A cloud of ancient dust filled the air. Eleanor cried out, a pained gasp, stumbling toward the wreckage. But Slim was faster. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in, and shoved her back against the counter. He got his face close to hers, his breath hot and foul. You didn't hear me, he whispered, his voice vibrating with menace. You got 24 hours. $500. Or we come back, and we don't just tip shelves. We light it. This whole dusty fire trap goes up in flames with you in it. He gave her one last shove for emphasis, sending her staggering. The three men turned, laughing as they walked out the door, the bell sounding a mocking tribute behind them. Eleanor Vance stood alone in the wreckage of her sanctuary. She was trembling, her heart hammering against her aching ribs. But as she looked at the broken spines of her husband's books, fear began to congeal into something else. Something cold, hard, and terrifyingly resolute. Her son was coming home. Night in Havenwood was thick and heavy when the cab pulled to the curb 2 blocks from Vance's Tomes and Tales. Jake Vance paid the driver, the man's gaze lingering for a moment on the silent, imposing dog sitting patiently on the floor. Jake stepped out, melting into the humid darkness with the ease of a man used to moving unseen. He was tall with the lean, functional muscle of a professional athlete, not a bodybuilder. His face, lean and sharp, was relaxed in repose, but his eyes, clear and razor sharp, were never still. They scanned the street, the rooftops, the alleyways. Beside him, Kaiser, a large, sable-coated German shepherd, stood with the unnerving stillness of a creature perfectly aware of its own power. Its intelligent eyes watched everything, its black nose testing the air. Jake gave a low, quiet command, and the dog moved to his heel as they approached the familiar alley that led to the apartment above the shop. Jake used his key at the private entrance, moving up the stairs in silence. He'd sent a final text from the airbase, letting his mom know he was on his way, and he expected to find her asleep. When he opened the door, he was met with the familiar smells of old, polished hardwood and his mother's faint rosewater perfume. But something was wrong. The air was tense. And his mother, Eleanor, was sitting in her armchair in the dim living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was just staring at the dark window. She started when he entered, a small gasp of surprise before her face flooded with relief. Jake. Oh, Jake, you're here. She rushed to embrace him, and he held her, his strength a stark contrast to her slender frame. He felt the tremor in her hands. Hey, Mom, he said softly, his voice a low baritone. Miss me? Kaiser nudged his head gently against Eleanor's hand, offering his own silent greeting. Eleanor laughed, a slightly breathless sound as she stroked the dog's noble head. And you, Kaiser. Welcome home, you beautiful boy. Jake stepped back, his eyes making a quick, professional sweep. She looked exhausted, the smile strained at the corners of her mouth. And then he saw it. On her left forearm, just below the sleeve of her robe, was a dark, distinct bruise in the shape of a gripping hand. He felt a cold, hard knot form in his gut. He kept his voice light. Tough day at the shop. Looks like you ran into a shelf. Eleanor instinctively pulled her sleeve down, her gaze shifting away. Oh, yes, clumsy me. I was trying to move that heavy Civil War atlas and I tripped over my own feet. You know me. Jake knew exactly who she was. Meticulous, careful, and not prone to falling. He didn't press. Not yet. He watched her as she bustled about, making tea she didn't seem to want. Her movements were quick and slightly jerky. The calm, centered woman he'd spoken to 2 days ago was gone, replaced by someone trying desperately to act normal. While Eleanor's back was turned, Jake glanced at Kaiser. The dog was not at ease. Instead of lying down, Kaiser had moved to the top of the stairs that led down to the shop's back entrance. He stood rigid, his nose pressed to the crack beneath the door, a low, nearly inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Jake whispered. Kaiser didn't look at him. He remained focused on the door, his senses locked on a scent that didn't belong. The smell of stale tobacco, unfamiliar sweat, and something else, the faint, acrid tang of fear. Jake moved over, placing a hand on the dog's neck. He could feel the animal's tension. His eyes moved from the dog to his mother, who was now clinking a spoon in a teacup. "Mom," he said, his voice casual. "I think I left one of my old training manuals downstairs in the shop. You mind if I go grab it?" Eleanor froze for a second. "Now, Jake? It's late. Can it wait until morning?" "Just take a second. Want to check the alarm panel anyway, make sure the codes are still good." Before she could protest further, he was down the stairs, Kaiser at his heels. He unlocked the door to the shop. The moment he opened it, the stench hit him, old smoke, cheap cologne, and the sharp, raw scent of splintered wood. He flicked on a small desk lamp, and he saw it. The massive cherrywood shelf, shattered on the floor. The books, his father's prized first editions, were scattered like casualties, their spines broken, their pages torn. This wasn't a woman tripping. This was violence. This was a violation. He felt a wave of cold, precise anger rise, an emotion he was trained to control and channel. Kaiser growled again, a deeper, more menacing sound, sniffing at the floor near the counter. Jake moved through the shop, his eyes taking in every detail, the overturned books, the muddy boot prints near the door, the small, dark smudges on the floorboards. He saw the security camera in the corner, a tiny black lens he himself had installed 2 years ago, disguised as a smoke detector. He went back upstairs, his face a mask of calm. Eleanor was standing where he had left her. "The shelf," she began, her voice trembling. I lied. I was going to clean it up before." Jake held up a hand gently, stopping her. "It's okay, Mom. I'm not mad." He went into his old bedroom, retrieved his laptop, and returned to the living room. "I'm just going to check the security footage, see who we need to send the repair bill to." Eleanor paled. "Jake, no, please. It's better to just let it go. They were dangerous." Her words confirmed his worst fears. He sat at the kitchen table, pulling up the secure feed. He typed in his password and navigated to the previous afternoon, and he watched. He watched Slim, Brick, and Weasel enter his mother's sanctuary. He watched them threaten her. He watched Brick destroy his father's legacy. He watched Slim grab his mother, shove her against the counter, his face distorted in a mask of ugly intimidation. He saw the threat, heard the words, "burn it," and 24 hours. He watched the entire 10-minute clip twice. The knot in his stomach tightened into a block of ice. The professional, controlled anger he reserved for combat zones was now flooded with something infinitely more powerful, a primal, protective rage. When the video finished, he slowly closed the laptop. The room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Eleanor was crying softly, her hand over her mouth. "They said they'd be back," she whispered. "Oh, Jake, I don't want you involved in this. This is your leave." Jake stood. He walked to his mother, knelt in front of her chair, and gently took her hands. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His voice, when he spoke, was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice he used on missions, the voice that meant decisions had been made and outcomes were already determined. "Mom, it's okay. You're safe now." He held her for a long moment. Then he rose and looked down at her, his gray eyes as clear and cold as a winter sky. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to come down and open the shop like any other day. Don't be afraid. I'll be here. And I will handle this." The morning light struggled through the Ohio humidity, casting a hazy, gray glow into Vance's tomes and tales. The shop was quiet, but the peace was a fragile skin. Eleanor Vance stood near the back, pretending to organize a shelf of biographies, her hands trembling so slightly it was almost imperceptible. She had followed Jake's instructions, opening at 9 a.m. sharp, the brass bell polished and the open sign displayed, but her heart hammered against her ribs with every footstep that passed on the sidewalk outside. She had spent the early morning hours watching her son. Jake Vance was a study in controlled opposition. He had meticulously cleaned the wreckage from the night before, his large, capable hands carefully sorting through the debris. He had salvaged what books he could, his touch surprisingly gentle, and had stacked the splintered wood of the cherry wood shelf neatly in the back alley. Now he was calmly wiping down the antique mahogany counter, his movements economical and deliberate. He wore simple jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders and back. He seemed utterly at peace, as if he were merely cleaning up after a minor accident. But Eleanor knew her son. Beneath that placid surface, Jake was coiled. He was waiting. She saw it in the way his eyes never rested, constantly flicking to the reflections in the front window, and in the set of his jaw. The most unnerving part, however, was Kaiser. The German shepherd wasn't lying by the hearth as she had imagined. On a silent command from Jake, the dog had slipped into the dark, discreet space beneath the main counter, completely hidden from view. He was invisible, but Eleanor knew he was there. She could feel the dog's pent-up energy, a silent, disciplined presence that was somehow more intimidating than a barking guard dog. It was waiting for a command she prayed would never come. The bell above the door rang, sharp and violent, shattering the quiet. Eleanor flinched, dropping a book with a soft thud. Her breath caught in her throat. It was them. Slim entered first, his greasy hair plastered to his head by the morning dew. He looked smug, his smirk still in place. Behind him came Brick, the giant having to duck under the doorway, and Weasel, who scurried in last. But there was a new face today. This one, Ghost, was thin and tall with sallow skin and a cheap blazer that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He had a vacant, mean smile on his face. As his eyes scanned the shop, Slim stopped short when he saw Jake. He looked him up and down, taking in his size, his calm, and his focused presence. Jake continued to wipe the counter with a cloth. Well, Slim sneered, his voice full of false bravado. Look what the old lady found. You hire a bodyguard? He sauntered forward, stopping a few feet from the counter. Ghost and Brick fanned out, blocking the exit. You're a big boy, ain't ya, Jim Muscle? Jake finished wiping a spot on the counter, his movements unhurried. He tossed the rag onto a back shelf and finally raised his head. His clear gray eyes met Slim's, and he didn't smile. She didn't hire anyone. I'm her son. And you're trespassing. Slim laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Her son? That's rich. Home on leave, are ya, soldier boy? Home to protect your mommy? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We're here for our 500, our protection fee. And since you made her late, the price went up. $750. From the corner, Eleanor spoke, her voice weak but clear. Jake, please, just let me pay them. It's not worth it. Jake didn't take his eyes off Slim. She's not paying you, he said, his voice even, calm, and carrying a finality that made the air go tight. You vandalized her property. You threatened her. You have about 10 seconds to turn around and walk out that door. And you're going to pay for the shelf you broke. This was too much for Slim. His reputation was built on fear, and this soldier boy wasn't showing any. He was being defied in front of his crew. His face darkened. You think you're tough? You're one man. We're four. He jerked his chin at Brick and Ghost. Teach him a lesson. Rough him up, but keep his wallet clean for the cash. It happened faster than Eleanor could blink. Brick, the mountain of a man, lunged forward, throwing a heavy, looping punch aimed at Jake's head. It was a street brawler's swing, all power and no technique. Jake didn't step back. He stepped in. In a blur of motion, he deflected the man's arm, using the big man's own momentum against him, securing a grip on his wrist and elbow. There was a sharp, wet pop as Jake applied precise pressure. Brick gasped, his eyes widening in shock as his arm was bent backward. Jake spun him, locking the joint, and drove him face first to the floor. Before Brick had even hit the ground, Ghost was coming, pulling a small baton from his jacket. He swung it wildly. Jake released Brick, pivoted on his heel, and the baton hissed through the air. Jake's hand shot out, not in a punch, but a palm heel strike, intercepting the man's forearm. His other hand grabbed the back of Ghost's neck. In a single, shockingly simple motion, he used the man's forward energy to slam his face into the floorboards. Ghost grunted and went still, the baton clattering away. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. Weasel, the twitchy one, was frozen by the door, his eyes like saucers. He looked at his two downed partners, then at Jake, who stood between them, his breathing even. Slim, his bravado vanished, staggered back. His panic took over. I'll kill you, he shrieked, fumbling in his pocket and producing a switchblade. The blade snapped out with a metallic click. He held it out, his hand trembling. "I'll gut you, I swear." He took one step toward Jake. "Kaiser, Waffe." Jake's command was sharp, low, and in German. It meant weapon. Before Slim could process the word, a black and tan missile launched from the dark space under the counter. Kaiser flew, aiming not for Slim's throat, but for the threat. His powerful jaws clamped down on Slim's forearm and wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. The sound was sickening, a wet crunch of bone and tissue. Slim screamed, a high, piercing shriek of pure agony that echoed off the bookshelves. The switchblade fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered on the floor. Kaiser did not release. He held, his paws planted, and a deep, terrifying growl rumbled up from his chest, vibrating his entire body. He was the perfect weapon, disciplined and lethal, pinning the man in place. Slim was sobbing now, tears of pain and terror streaming down his face. "Get him off. Get him off me, please." Weasel bolted for the door, abandoning his boss. Brick and Ghost were groaning, trying to push themselves up, but the fight was clearly gone from them. Jake calmly walked forward, picked up the switchblade, and closed it. He stood over Slim, looking down at the pathetic, whimpering man. Kaiser still held fast, his eyes locked on Slim. "Kaiser, aus!" Jake commanded. "Out!" Instantly, the dog released and backed away, sitting at Jake's heel, his chest still rumbling, saliva dripping from his jowls. Slim crumpled to the floor, cradling his mangled arm to his chest. Jake knelt, meeting his eyes, his own gray gaze as cold and hard as granite. "Get out," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper, yet more frightening than all of Slim's shouting. "Take your trash with you. And if you ever come near my mother or this shop again, I won't call my dog off." Slim scrambled backward out of the shop, dragging his ruined arm, his mind a vortex of pain and absolute terror. The shouts of Brick and Ghost echoed behind him as they staggered out, one clutching a dislocated shoulder, the other bleeding from the face. They didn't stop running until they were 3 blocks away, collapsing in a heap in a grimy alley, the stench of rotting garbage mingling with their humiliation. Slim was gasping, the pain in his arm so intense it made him nauseous. But beneath the pain was a deeper, colder fear. He had failed, and he had to report that failure to a man who did not tolerate it. His career, and possibly his life, now depended on convincing his boss they hadn't been beaten by one man. They had been beaten by a monster. An hour later, Slim was standing in the sleek lobby of a high-end logistics firm in Havenwood's warehouse district. The contrast was stark. No thugs, no obvious weapons, just cool air conditioning, minimalist art, and a severe receptionist who looked at Slim's mangled arm and bloodied face with complete indifference. She waved him in. The office beyond was a vast, glass-walled space overlooking Lake Erie. Julian Croft stood at the window, not looking at Slim, but at a container ship gliding past. He was a man in his 40s, tall with salt and pepper haircut and a military-style crop. He wore a crisp white shirt and tailored trousers. Nothing about him suggested criminality, except for the absolute stillness in his eyes, which were as cold and gray as the lake water below. "You're getting blood on my floor, Slim," Croft said, his voice calm, cultured, and utterly devoid of emotion. Slim flinched. "Boss, you don't understand. It wasn't just some guy. This guy. He ain't human. He took down Brick and Ghost in 2 seconds, broke their arms. And he's got this dog, this thing." Croft turned slowly. His gaze dropped to Slim's arm, which he was cradling, wrapped in a filthy rag. Croft's expression was one of mild disappointment, the kind a biologist might show a failed experiment. "He had a dog," Croft repeated, as if tasting the words. "You, Brick, Ghost, and Weasel. 4 of my men sent to collect from an old woman in a bookstore were beaten by her son and a dog." "He's military, boss, I swear," Slim pleaded, desperation making his voice crack. "He moves fast, crazy fast. And the dog, it's trained. It went for the knife. It knew what it was doing." Croft walked to his pristine desk and pressed an intercom button. "Send in a cleaner, and have Dr. Alistair meet Slim in the medical bay. He's had a work-related accident." He looked back at Slim, his eyes empty. "You didn't fail because he was fast, Slim. You failed because you were slow. You were a blunt instrument. You went in loud, expecting a sheep, and you found a wolf. And worse, you made us look weak. You made me look weak in my own territory." Croft adjusted his tie. "This wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It's about respect. It's about order. This soldier boy has disrupted the order. Go get your arm fixed. You're off the street. You'll be on sanitation duty until I decide if you have any use left at all. Slim, flooded with a bizarre mixture of relief and humiliation, hurried from the room. Croft turned back to the window, his mind already working. This wasn't a problem for thugs. This required a scalpel. Back at Vance's Tomes and Tales, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Jake Vance had locked the shop door, the open sign flipped to closed indefinitely. He had guided his mother upstairs, his calm demeanor never wavering. Eleanor Vance sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her trembling hands. Jake was gently cleaning the bruises on her arm, his touch professional but tender. "Jake, who were they?" she whispered. "Just bullies, Mom, they won't be a problem anymore." But he knew it was a lie. The kind of efficiency he had used, the kind of damage Kaiser had inflicted was not something a street crew just let go. He'd cut the head off a snake, and now he needed to know if it was part of a hydra. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Yeah, Carter." A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Ben, it's Jake. You busy?" There was a rustle on the other end, the sound of a car door closing. "Jake? No kidding. Thought you were still overseas. Don't tell me you're in Havenwood." Ben Carter was a detective with the Havenwood P.D., a man with tired eyes and a cynicism that hadn't quite extinguished the spark of the Army Ranger he'd once been. He and Jake had gone through parts of their training together, and they shared a bond forged in places the rest of the world pretended didn't exist. "Landed last night, short leave," Jake said, his voice low. "Listen, I've got a situation. Local flavor. A crew tried to extort my mom at her bookstore. A guy named Slim." The friendly tone in Ben's voice vanished, replaced by a professional coldness. "Jake, you tell me exactly what happened right now." Jake recounted the events, from the broken shelf to the 4 men, the knife, and the dog. He was brief, tactical. When he finished, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end. "Ben, you there?" "You just stepped in it, Jake. You stepped in it deep," Ben said, his voice grim. "Slim is nothing. He's a nobody. He shines the shoes of a man named Julian Croft. And Croft is not a nobody." Jake felt the cold knot return. "Talk to me." Croft, Ben explained, ran half the contraband that moved through the ports on the lake. Weapons, high-end narcotics. He wasn't a thug. He was a CEO. He was smart. He was disciplined. And he was utterly ruthless. He owned politicians, judges, and he owned this territory. We've been trying to build a case against him for 2 years, but he's insulated. He's a ghost." Ben sighed. "You just humiliated his crew on his own front porch. This stops being about $500 and starts being about his reputation. He can't let this go. He's going to see this as a challenge from a rival, not a son protecting his mother." "What's his move?" Jake asked, his mind already shifting from defense to offense. "Not this," Ben said. "He won't send more of Slim's idiots. He'll send professionals. Or he'll make it personal. Jake, you're not in a war zone. You're in a city. You have rules. He doesn't. Get your mom out of there. Take her to a hotel. Anywhere but there." "I'm not running, Ben. This is my home." "Then you listen to me," Ben ordered. "I'm sending a patrol car to sit on your street just for observation. But Jake, be careful. This guy is the real deal." Jake hung up. The weight of the conversation settled on him. He looked at his mother, who was watching him with worried eyes. He forced a reassuring smile. "Just catching up with an old friend, Mom. Everything's under control." He spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the shop and apartment, checking locks, sight lines from other buildings, and the alley access. Kaiser moved with him, a silent shadow, his senses taut as a wire. The patrol car Ben promised was a welcome sight, parked discreetly down the street. It was a deterrent, but Jake knew a deterrent was useless against a man like Croft. Croft wouldn't come while the police were watching. He'd wait. Or he'd find another way. That thought sent a chill down Jake's spine. He was standing in the living room looking out the window when his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. He opened it. It was a video file. His blood turned to ice. It was a high-definition video, shot from across the street, of his mother. It was from that morning, before he'd arrived. Eleanor, in her bright yellow cardigan, was at the farmer's market, completely unaware. She was smiling, chatting with a vendor, picking out a peach. The camera zoomed in close enough to see the lines around her eyes, then slowly pulled back, showing the crowd, showing how vulnerable she was. A text message arrived a moment later. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. You're fast. But you can't be everywhere. The video message was a declaration of war. Jake Vance stared at the image of his mother's smiling, unaware face, and a switch flipped inside him. The civilized, controlled man his mother knew receded, and the seal took over. The cold, precise anger from the day before settled into an icy, operational calm. Croft had made this personal. He had crossed a line that, in Jake's world, there was no coming back from. He turned to his mother, his voice gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. "Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The men from yesterday, they were pawns. The man they work for is the real threat, and he's not going to stop. You aren't safe here." Eleanor Vance's face went pale. "The police, Ben." "Ben's a good man, but he's one detective," Jake said, already moving. "And a patrol car down the street won't stop a professional. This guy is sending a message. I'm going to send one back." He led her to the back of the shop, to an old cellar door normally hidden under a heavy Persian rug. "What is this, Jake?" "The wine cellar. It's musty." "It's more than that, Mom." He had spent 2 of his leaves years ago fortifying the space under the guise of historical preservation. He undid a heavy, modern lock he'd installed himself and swung the door open, revealing a small, dry, and well-lit room. It was lined with reinforced concrete, had its own ventilation system, and a heavy, bank vault-style door. It was stocked with water, blankets, a medical kit, and a satellite phone. "Jake, you. When did you?" "After Dad died," he said softly. I needed to know you were safe." He led her inside and sat her on a small cot. "You're going to stay in here. Do not open this door for any reason. Not even for me. I will come and get you when it's over." He looked her in the eyes. "I have to handle this, Mom. The only way to keep you safe is to end it, right now." She saw the man her son had become, the warrior he had hidden from her. She nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket he handed her. "Be careful, Jake." "They're the ones who should have been careful," he said. He closed the heavy door, the locking mechanism clicking into place with a cold finality. Now the apartment and the shop were his. He was alone with Kaiser. "Vaca," he commanded. "Guard." Kaiser immediately lay down by the cellar door, a silent, living sentry. Jake moved through the shop and the apartment above, his movements fluid and economical. This was his battle space, and he was preparing it. First, all the lights went out. The patrol car Ben had sent was gone, likely diverted to another call, just as Jake had predicted. The street was dark, bathed in the humid, heavy Ohio night. The shop was plunged into inky blackness. He propped open the connecting door between the shop and the upstairs apartment, creating one large, multi-level combat zone. He moved furniture, not to create barricades, but to create channels and funnels that his muscle memory and Kaiser's senses could navigate, but which a stranger would stumble through. He took the small brass bell from the front door and rigged it with a thin black thread across the main hallway, a crude but effective early warning system. He and Kaiser retreated to the second-floor landing, a dark vantage point that overlooked both the apartment's main room and the top of the stairs leading down into the shop. Jake was dressed in dark clothing, his skin melting into the shadows. He didn't have his service weapon. He had a 15-inch steel pry bar from his toolkit and a set of heavy-duty zip ties. And he had Kaiser. They waited for 2 hours. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the distant hum of the city. Then, the clock struck 2 a.m. At 2:03 a.m., Jake heard it. Not a sound, but the lack of one. The faint ambient noise on the quiet street had been momentarily muffled. Kaiser's head came up, his ears swiveling, a low growl suppressed deep in his chest. Jake placed a hand on his neck. "Ruhig. Quiet." Downstairs, the front door lock clicked, not broken, but picked with professional skill. The door swung open with a soft whoosh. 5 men in black tactical gear slipped inside. They moved as a unit, fanning out with hand signals in the dark. These were not Slim's thugs. These were professionals, armed with suppressed pistols. Their leader, a tall man Jake mentally dubbed Alpha, directed 2 toward the back and 2, including himself, toward the stairs to the apartment. A 5th man, Echo, stayed near the door on overwatch. They were here to kill him and abduct his mother. Alpha and the 2nd man, Bravo, started up the stairs, their movements silent, their weapons raised. They didn't see Jake, who was pressed into an alcove at the very top. But as Alpha cleared the landing, he snagged the thin thread. The brass bell tinkled, a cheerful, shockingly loud sound in the dead silence. Alpha froze. In that half-second of confusion, Jake moved. He exploded from the alcove, aiming not for Alpha, but for Bravo, the man behind him. He brought the pry bar down in a silent, brutal strike to the man's forearm, shattering the bone in his weapon grip. The man's silent gasp was cut off as Jake drove a knee into his solar plexus, doubling him over. Alpha swung around, bringing his weapon up, but something else was moving in the dark. Kaiser. Fast. The German Shepherd launched from the shadows, aiming not for the man, but for the weapon, just as Jake had trained him. His jaws clamped onto Alpha's wrist and pistol, his weight and power pulling the man off balance, his shot going wild into the ceiling with a muffled thud. Jake was on him, a forearm to the throat, pinning him to the wall. He stripped the man's weapon and applied a precise nerve strike to the side of his neck. Alpha went limp, unconscious. Downstairs, the other two operators, Charlie and Delta, heard the scuffle and the muffled shot. They rushed the stairs. This was what Jake was waiting for. They were funneled. As they charged up the staircase, Kaiser, released from Alpha, met them. He hit Charlie low at the knees, a 90-pound wrecking ball of muscle and bone. The man tumbled backward, taking Delta with him in a tangle of limbs. They landed in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. Before they could recover, Jake was on them, a dark phantom moving with terrifying speed. A blow to Charlie's temple. A joint lock and choke on Delta. It was over in seconds. One left. Echo, the Overwatch. He had seen his teammates disappear into the darkness and not return. He was backing toward the door, his pistol sweeping the shadows. Alpha, Bravo, report. His voice was a strained whisper. Jake answered by throwing the pry bar into a bookshelf on the far side of the room. It hit with a loud crash of wood and paper. Echo spun and fired 2 rounds at the sound. It was the mistake Jake needed. While the man was focused on the noise, Kaiser emerged from the darkness behind him, silent as smoke. He didn't bite. He slammed his body into the back of Echo's knees. The man's legs buckled, and as he fell backward, Jake was there, catching him from behind. One hand over the man's mouth, one arm cutting off the blood flow to his brain. The man struggled for 3 seconds, then went limp. The shop was silent again. Jake stood in the middle of the room, his breathing deep and even. 5 professional operators, neutralized. None of them dead. He used his zip ties, securing all of them, binding their hands and feet. He checked their equipment, suppressed pistols, knives, night vision goggles, and a medical kit with sedatives and heavy restraints. For his mother. A cold rage deeper than anything he had ever felt washed over him. This was Croft's answer. He had sent a kill team into a civilian home. Jake went to the cellar door, Kaiser at his heels. He knocked a specific rhythm. "Mom, it's me. We're clear." The pre-dawn hours in Havenwood were a deep, heavy black. The air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing water. In a sterile, climate-controlled warehouse office miles from the quaint historic district, Julian Croft was watching a silent, grainy feed on a large monitor. The feed came from a microdrone, a high-end piece of equipment, and it was aimed at the front door of Vance's Tomes and Tales. He'd been watching it for an hour, sipping an espresso, waiting for his 5-man team, his scalpel, to emerge with their targets. They were 30 minutes late. His cultured calm was beginning to fray, an impatient tapping of his finger on the steel desk the only sign of his annoyance. Then he saw movement. The front door of the shop opened, but it wasn't his team. It was the soldier, Jake Vance. The man moved with a disturbing lack of urgency. He was dragging something. Croft zoomed in. It was his team leader, Alpha, bound at the wrists and ankles with zip ties. Jake dragged the unconscious man onto the sidewalk, deposited him like a bag of trash, and went back inside. One by one, he emerged again, dragging out the other 4 operators, leaving them in an ignominious heap on the pavement. Croft stared, his espresso cup frozen halfway to his lips. 5 professional, highly paid assets, neutralized by 1 man and a dog in the dark in under 20 minutes. The soldier hadn't just beaten them. He had humiliated them. He was displaying them. A cold, volcanic rage unlike anything Croft had felt in years began to burn in his chest. This was no longer a disruption of order. This was a hostile takeover. This soldier was a predator, a high-level threat who had just openly declared war. The financial loss of the team was staggering, but the loss of face was catastrophic. His phone buzzed. It was Ben Carter, a detective he knew was on his payroll, though Croft had never dealt with him directly. He ignored it. His mind was already working, calculating, the cold CEO merging with the brutal street king he had once been. He pressed a button on his console. Assemble everyone. All security divisions, Grade A equipment. We're moving in 15. From the shop, Jake had just placed the last man on the curb. He used Alpha's high-tech radio to dial the only number he knew would work. Ben, it's Jake. I've got 5 packages for you on the sidewalk in front of my mom's shop. They're hostile, professional, and armed. I need a quiet pickup, and I need you to get my mother out of here. The situation has escalated. Ben Carter, driving at high speed through the dark streets in his unmarked sedan, nearly swerved. 5 packages. Jake, what did you do? SWAT is still 20 minutes from staging. Just get here, Ben, Jake said, his voice flat. And come quiet. The primary target, Croft, he's watching. Jake disconnected and ran inside, bolting the heavy door. He had exposed the enemy, but he knew the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. He raced upstairs to the safe room. He unlatched the heavy door and found his mother, Eleanor Vance, pale but composed, holding a book she wasn't reading. Mom, we have to go. They're coming back, and they're coming heavy. He pulled her gently from the room. We need to get to the back alley. Ben's on his way. Just then, the night exploded. It wasn't police sirens. It was the screech of tires and the slam of doors. 3 heavy black SUVs had screeched to a halt in front of the shop, their headlights illuminating the street and highlighting the 5 unconscious operators on the curb. Roughly 15 men poured out, dressed in black and carrying weapons Jake recognized instantly: short-barreled rifles, tactical shotguns. This was a paramilitary force. Ben Carter and his partner, Detective Riley, a young, sharp-eyed woman new to the unit, had pulled up at the end of the street, a block away. They arrived just in time to see Croft's army deploy. Get on the radio, Ben yelled at Riley. Officer pinned, multiple hostiles, heavy weapons, body armor. We need SWAT now. As Riley frantically relayed the information, Ben saw a man step out of the lead SUV. It was Croft. Unmistakable, in his crisp white shirt, a stark target in the dark. He wasn't hiding. He was making a statement. A sudden burst of automatic fire tore through the air, aimed at their car. Get down! Ben screamed, pulling Riley with him as the windshield dissolved into a spiderweb of cracks. They were pinned, outgunned, and completely exposed. Jake had pulled Eleanor and Kaiser into the kitchen at the rear of the apartment, which overlooked the alley. He heard the gunfire and knew Ben was compromised. The front of the building was a war zone. The back alley was their only hope. He was peering through the curtains when a man's voice, amplified by a bullhorn, boomed through the street. Soldier, I know you're in there. You've cost me a great deal tonight. You took my property. A very expensive mistake. It was Croft. His voice was no longer cultured or calm. It was tight with rage. Throw out your weapons. Walk out the front door and I'll let your mother live. Jake looked at Eleanor. Her face was a mask of terror, but she was clutching Kaiser's fur, and the dog's solid, warm presence seemed to be the only thing keeping her upright. Jake knew it was a lie. Croft would leave no witnesses. He's lying, Mom. Stay down and stay with Kaiser, Jake whispered. He didn't answer the bullhorn. His silence was his only weapon now. He needed to buy time for SWAT. His silence was his answer, and it was the one thing Croft could not abide. The CEO mask dissolved, revealing the cornered, raging animal beneath. You disrespect me in my city? Croft roared, his voice cracking. You think you can hide? You want to hide in that dusty matchbox? Fine. Burn it. Burn it all to the ground. The order was carried out instantly. Jake watched in horror as 2 of Croft's men, who had been carrying heavy cans, lit rags stuffed into glass bottles. The first Molotov cocktail hit the shop's front window, erupting in a bright orange whoosh. The second shattered the glass, landing squarely in a display of Civil War histories. The effect was instantaneous. The dry, ancient paper and old, dry wood of the historic building acted as perfect kindling. A low roar filled the air as the fire took hold, sucking in oxygen and breathing out thick, black smoke. The shop's alarm began to shriek, a useless wail against the sound of the growing inferno. Upstairs, the heat was immediate. Smoke began to pour up the stairwell, thick and acrid. The smell of burning paper, of history being incinerated, was sickening. Gunfire erupted again as Croft's men began firing into the upstairs windows, pinning Jake, Eleanor, and Kaiser away from any escape. The front of the building was a wall of flame. The back was covered by gunfire. The distant wail of sirens was being drowned out by the roar of the fire and the sound of shattering glass. They were trapped, caught between the inferno and the men who had come to kill them. The heat was a physical blow. The air in the upstairs apartment had become thick and black, a toxic soup of burning history and melting chemicals. Eleanor Vance was on the floor, coughing violently, her lungs screaming for air. The roar of the fire below was deafening, a hungry beast devouring her life's work. The gunfire from the street continued, a relentless, deadly rhythm. Kaiser was pressed against her, whining low in his throat, his body a solid barrier against the chaos. "Mom, this way. Stay low." Jake Miller's voice cut through the panic, a beacon of absolute calm. He wasn't moving toward the back stairs. They were an exposed shooting gallery. He was pulling her back toward the center of the apartment, back toward the staircase that led down into the hell of the shop. "Jake, no, the fire." She gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not the way in," he yelled over the roar. "It's the way through." He half lifted her, his strength seemingly endless, and guided her down the smoke-filled stairs. The heat was searing, but the smoke was thinner here, being drawn upward. He moved across the shop floor, now a sea of orange, and kicked open the unlocked cellar door, pulling her into the relative cool of the basement. The safe room he'd built was a haven, but it was also a concrete box. He didn't lead her to it. He led her past it to the far wall of the original 19th century foundation. "Dad and I found this when I was 16, he explained, his voice impossibly calm as he pulled a loose brick from the wall. Behind it was a small, rusted iron ring. We were exploring. Dad always said this old building had secrets." He pulled the ring, and a section of the brick wall, perfectly disguised, swung inward with a gasp of old, earthy air. Before them was a narrow, dark tunnel, just high enough to stoop in. "It's a prohibition tunnel, Mom. It runs under the old district. It's how we get out." He nudged Kaiser in first. "For on, go." The dog entered without hesitation. He helped his mother in, then followed, pulling the heavy false door closed behind them. The roar of the fire was instantly muffled, replaced by a claustrophobic, earthy silence and the drip of water somewhere in the dark. Jake flicked on a powerful flashlight, illuminating a narrow brick-lined passage. It was stuffy, smelling of damp earth, mildew, and a century of secrets. He took his mother's hand. "It's okay. About a 3-minute walk. It comes out in an alley 2 blocks from here. I told Ben about this entrance years ago, just in case." Eleanor was shaking, but she was moving. Her faith in her son was absolute. They moved as quickly as they could, Kaiser leading the way, his footing sure in the dark. The air was cool and breathable. They were safe. They were halfway to the exit, the faint glow of a street lamp in the alley visible ahead, when Jake stopped. Eleanor stumbled slightly. "Jake, what is it?" Jake turned, his face, streaked with soot, a mask of grim calculation in the flashlight beam. He could still hear the distant sounds of the siege, the crackle of fire, the pop of gunfire. "He won't stop, Mom," he said, his voice low and hard. "You heard him. He's not just a criminal. He's unhinged. As long as Croft is out there, he will never stop hunting you. Running isn't enough." Eleanor's eyes filled with a new fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Jake said, "that I'm not running. I'm finishing this." He turned to the creature he trusted as much as himself. He knelt before Kaiser and took his mother's frail hand, placing it firmly on the dog's heavy-duty harness. "Kaiser." The dog's intelligent eyes locked on his. "Foreign, beschützen. Lead, protect." He looked the dog squarely in the eye. "Get her to Ben. Get her to the light. Do not stop. Do not leave her. Verstanden. Understood?" Kaiser let out a low, affirmative whine, nudging his head against Eleanor's hand. He understood the mission. "Jake, no." Eleanor cried, grabbing his arm. "Don't go back. You can't. It's an inferno." "It's the only way, Mom," he said, his voice softening for a brief second. He kissed her on the forehead, a quick, firm gesture. "He thinks I'm trapped or dead. He's arrogant and he's focused on the fire. Right now, he's vulnerable. It's the only chance I'll get." He gently pushed her toward the exit. "Go. I'm not letting him win. I'll see you on the other side. Trust Kaiser." He turned his back on her, on safety, and sprinted back into the tunnel's suffocating darkness, back toward the fire. He emerged into the cellar like a ghost. The heat was immense. The house above him was groaning, the sound of a great beast in its death throes. He went up the cellar stairs and peered into the shop. The fire had consumed the front, but the back alley, where he'd left the kitchen door, was now filled with smoke and movement. Croft's men were moving, using the fire as cover, believing their targets were dead or trapped on the upper floors. He heard Croft shouting orders, his voice strained with rage. "Find them. I want bodies." Check every alley, every rooftop. Jake slipped out the back door, not into the alley, but up. He used a drainpipe and solid old brickwork to haul himself onto the flat roof of the kitchen. He was above them now. The alley was a scene of chaos, lit by the flickering orange glow of the fire. Croft's men, about 10 of them, were clustered together, their attention divided between the fire and the sound of approaching sirens. They were exposed. Jake moved across the rooftop, a shadow in the smoke. He dropped to a lower awning directly behind a man watching the street, a hand over his mouth, a forearm cutting off the air. Jake held the man until he went limp, then zip-tied him and left him in the shadows. He moved to the next, a man shouting to his companion. Jake used the noise of the fire. He was a phantom, an instrument of precise, silent violence. One by one, the men in the alley started to disappear. The group, sensing their dwindling numbers, panicked. Where's Rico? Where's Angel? Croft, standing near the back door, his white shirt now stained with soot, finally realized what was happening. His enemy wasn't in the fire. His enemy was the fire. He's out here, Croft screamed, his composure shattered. He's on the roofs. Get him. Several men fired blindly into the smoky darkness above, their bullets pinging uselessly off brick. In his panic, Croft made a fatal mistake. He backed into the building, into the main reading room, seeking cover from the ghost he couldn't see. The room was a furnace, but the central staircase had created a void where the flames had not yet reached. He raised his pistol, peering into the smoke. A dark shape detached itself from the rafters above. Jake dropped, landing in a perfect combat roll, coming up between Croft and his only exit. He was a terrifying sight, covered in grime, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. The fire of the burning shop reflected in them. You, Croft stammered, raising his pistol. You're supposed to be dead. You came into my home. Jake's voice was a low growl. You threatened my mother. Croft fired, but Jake wasn't there. He moved faster than a man could track, closing the distance. The fight was a mismatch. Jake broke the man's wrist, sending the gun clattering into the embers. Croft, the CEO, tried to throw a punch, which Jake ignored, driving his shoulder into the man's solar plexus. The air left Croft's lungs in a woof. Jake spun him, slammed his face into a smoldering wall, and zip-tied his hands with ruthless efficiency. Just then, the entire front wall of the shop collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and flame. The SWAT team, led by Ben Carter, had finally breached, using the collapse as their entry. They poured in, weapons high, shouting, "Freeze! Police!" Through the smoke and heat, Ben saw two figures. Jake. He yelled. Jake emerged from the flames, dragging the coughing, beaten Croft with him. He shoved the man forward, and Croft fell to his knees at the detective's feet. This one's yours, Ben, Jake gasped, the adrenaline finally starting to fade. The rest of his crew, they're in the alley. The world compressed into a vortex of noise and light. Jake Vance stood amidst the roiling smoke and roaring flames, a phantom emerged from hell, his hand clamped on Julian Croft's collar. The sudden breach of the SWAT team, their black uniforms and heavy weapons flooding the burning room, was a jarring transition from his silent hunt. Ben Carter, his own face a mask of grime and shock, pushed through his team. Jake, he yelled, his voice strained. Get him out. The roof is coming down. Jake shoved Croft forward. The man stumbled and fell to his knees at Ben's feet, a pathetic, coughing wretch, stripped of all his power. This one's yours, Ben, Jake gasped, the adrenaline finally starting to ebb. The rest of his crew. They're in the alley, secured. Ben stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. The defeated crime lord, the 10 zip-tied men his team was now rounding up in the alley, and the lone, soot-covered soldier who had done it all. Go! Ben shouted, pulling Jake toward the exit as a massive beam crashed down where they had been standing. Go to your mother. We've got him. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He ran, sprinting past the firefighters now battling the massive blaze, past the police barricades, and down the street to the prearranged rally point, the mouth of the tunnel alley 2 blocks away. He saw her before she saw him. Eleanor Vance was wrapped in a thick firefighter's coat, her face pale. Beside her, Kaiser stood like a statue, his mission complete, his gaze fixed on the alley from which Jake would emerge. Mom! Eleanor's head snapped up. She cried out his name, a sound of such profound relief it cut through the sirens. She ran to him, and he met her halfway, sweeping her into his arms, holding her tight as she sobbed against his chest. He was covered in ash and smelled of smoke, but he was whole. He was alive. It's over, Mom, he whispered into her silver hair. It's all over. You're safe. The sun rose a few hours later, a pale, hazy watercolor, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Vance's Tomes and Tales was gone. The building stood as a blackened, hollowed-out skeleton. The roof had collapsed, and the smell of damp ash hung heavy in the morning air. Eleanor and Jake stood across the street, a local charity having provided them with clothes and a hotel room. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the ruin, her expression one of deep, quiet grief. Her history, her husband's legacy, was a pile of rubble. Eleanor, dear. Oh my lord. Mrs. Peterson, her kind neighbor from the day before, approached them, her hands fluttering at her chest. She was carrying a thermos.
I saw the news.
Your shop, your home. Oh, Eleanor. She poured a cup of hot coffee and pressed it into Eleanor's trembling hands. Soon others came. First, Mr. Henderson, a grim-faced man who owned the hardware store on the corner. He'd been paying Croft's protection fees for years. He stood beside Eleanor, looking at the wreckage. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick. We were all so afraid. What your son did last night, he didn't just save you. He saved all of us. More shop owners gathered, a small, solemn crowd. They were the bakers, the coffee shop owners, the antique dealers. They were the community Croft had held hostage with fear. Meanwhile, at the police station, Ben Carter was looking at the contents of an encrypted hard drive. Jake had pulled it off the Alpha operator he'd left on the sidewalk. He was a professional, Jake had told him. And professionals keep records. Jake, with his specialized training, had bypassed the encryption. It was all there. Shipping manifests for illegal arms, offshore bank accounts, a list of compromised city officials, warehouse locations. It was Croft's entire empire on a silver platter. It was the irrefutable evidence Ben had dreamed of for 2 years. Croft's reign was well and truly over. Weeks passed. The ruined building was cleared. The indictments against Croft and his entire network were overwhelming. The evidence was undeniable. But the story was no longer about Croft. It was about Eleanor. A fund, started by Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Peterson, was established. The community, finally free of the shadow that had hung over them, poured their hearts and their wallets into it. Donations came from all over Havenwood. Mr. Henderson's hardware store donated all the lumber. Local carpenters volunteered their weekends. The city, eager to erase the stain of Croft's corruption, fast-tracked the permits. 6 weeks after the fire, on a brilliant, sunny Ohio afternoon, a crowd gathered again. A bright red ribbon was stretched across the entrance of a brand new building, one that looked almost identical to the old one, but built with sturdy new timber and reinforced brick. A new brass bell hung above the door. Eleanor Vance, her eyes glistening with tears, stood at the front, flanked by Ben, Mrs. Peterson, and Mr. Henderson. She cut the ribbon. The new Vance's Tomes and Tales was open. The inside was beautiful. The shelves were new, but the layout was the same. The air smelled of freshly cut pine and new paper, and in the center, in the exact spot of the old one, was a magnificent, handcrafted cherrywood shelf. Jake had spent the last 2 weeks of his leave in a woodshop, recreating his father's prized shelf down to the last detail. The next morning, the shop was quiet. Jake, in fresh jeans and a t-shirt, stood by the door, a simple duffel bag at his feet. His leave was over. Kaiser stood patiently beside him, his tail giving a soft, steady thump against Jake's leg. Eleanor came from behind the counter and hugged him. This hug was different from the desperate, frightened one on the street. This one was strong, filled with gratitude and a deep, aching love. You'll be safe? Jake asked, his voice low. She stepped back, smiling, and reached up to fix his collar. We'll be safe, Jake. You taught us how. She wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking about the neighborhood. Croft was gone, but so was the fear. Jake's courage had been contagious. It had reminded the community that together, they were stronger than any bully. Jake knelt and gave Kaiser one last pat. Vaca. Guard. Though the dog was leaving with him, the command was for his mother. Guard her. He turned and walked out the door, the brass bell chiming softly. Eleanor Vance watched her son, her soldier, walk down the brick street, his shadow merging with that of his loyal companion. She watched until he turned the corner. Then she turned back, adjusted a book on the new shelf, and looked up as the bell chimed again. Welcome to Vance's Tomes and Tales, she said to her first new customer, her voice clear and strong. How may I help you?